It's time to work on the patchwork flag of our Star-Spangled Beauty ladder quilt. The patchwork flag is on page 42. There are two parts to the flag. All of the fabrics have been fused with interfacing on the back, and I have the batting. There are also star buttons that come with the embellishment kit to use on the flag. However, if you choose not to get the embellishment kit or want to use the buttons in other places on the quilt, they do have the embroidery file that has the stars that can be stitched onto the flag instead. Let's get started on the patchwork flag. Before I start working in software, I want to go over how the flag is going to be made, and there are two ways to actually quilt these pieces of fabric. In the directions, you'll notice that they give either a standard size or a block by block size when you cut your fabric. And this is also back in the cutting diagram. You'll notice that some blocks have highlighted blue with a little bit different size. And what that means is this larger size, for example, the two smaller parts of the flag, which are these first two strips, you can either cut them 6 by 2.5 inches, or you can cut them 5.5 inches by 2 inches. Now that might seem confusing. This standard size will actually be the size they are cut to when we're done quilting and we trim the block to size. However, essentially these are borders, and you can quilt borders two different ways. And so I have decided I'm going to show both ways. One with the larger size of fabric, and I'll do two with the larger size, and I'm going to do the other two with the standard cut size. And so I have all of my stripes or my strips of fabric, all 4 of them. I cut them the larger size. And so I need to cut the two, I think I'll do the 2 longer strips with the second method. And so I will cut these down. Right now they are 2.5 by 9. I will cut them down to 2 by 8.5 and then show you how to work those. I've opened Embroidery Essential software, and I'm going to bring in all of the background quilting for this flag. So I've opened the folder where I keep my files, and I'm going to go to the quilting bundle. The first quilting that I'm going to bring in is exclusive to this quilting bundle. So if you purchase the quilting bundle for the Star-Spangled Beauty ladder quilt, you will have this quilting. It's not available separately, but I am going to open this and drag and drop, and this is for the corner of the flag. Now the rest of the pieces to quilt the stripes are under the Patriotic 5 border, and there are a set of words and a set of florals for these stripes. So let's start with the words. Now you'll notice, if you've done Kimberbell before, that usually their border quilting, which essentially these stripes are borders, usually come in 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, I think all the way up to 6 inch border quilting backgrounds. You'll notice that this set also has 1.5 inch, and that was because it's specifically made for this patchwork flag. They also give 1 inch and 2 inch sizes, so you can use for something else, but we are going to be working with the 1.5 inch. So the first one I'm going to bring in is for the smaller stripe that has the words, and that is going to be this very first 1.5 inch by 7 inch. I will drag and drop that into the hoop. And then the second, I need a longer to fit the longer stripe, and I'm going to choose the 1.5 by 12 inch. I'm going to drag and drop that into the hoop. Now I'm going to go back to the floral, and I'm going to bring in the floral for the small stripe, which is this 1.5 by 7. and then the large, which will be this 1.5 by 10. So let me separate all these and we can see what we have to work with. First thing I'm going to do is select all. I'm going to Command A on my Mac, and I'm going to come up and rotate these to the left so that they're in the same orientation that our flag will be in. It'll be a little bit easier to see. So let me kind of arrange these. Here's the corner, and then we have the smaller border, and I'm actually going to rotate that again. I want this, so this larger flower is on the left, but it doesn't matter. That will be the top stripe, and then the words, and then we need the other floral, and I'm going to do the same thing with this floral. I think this looks like it's up. The other way looked like it was a little bit upside down, and then the words. So I want you to notice a couple of things right off the bat. So looking at these, they don't look the same sizes, and they aren't the same sizes. And so let me kind of show you how this is going to work. Now, this America that is on the second stripe is actually about the right size for the stitching. You can see it's almost 5 inches. When this stripe is cut to size after we quilt, it is going to be 5.5 by 2. And so I'm going to call this 5 inches since it's so close. And then there would be 1/4 inch on each side that would be in the seam allowance. So this is about the correct size for that smaller stripe. Now you can see up here that the other small stripe, which will be the red piece of fabric, is much longer, and that's really not a problem because we will just quilt our whole piece of fabric and cut it to size. And so some of these flowers will be cut off, and that's not an issue. But this is a little different because Kimberbell usually has specific sizes and they fit the blocks. And so this might seem a little different, especially if you're new to doing this. So the same thing with these two on the bottom. If you look at the picture of the finished flag, and I'm going to put a picture up to see that the bottom stripe only comes to about the eye in America if you were to use this border. And so again, you would just quilt your whole strip, and our strip, our longer strip, is either 9 inches if you cut it to the larger size. It will be cut to 8.5, or if you cut it exactly to size, it will be 8.5 when you quilt it. And you can see that this is over 10 inches. And that's why you would just quilt your piece of fabric. A lot of this quilting will run onto the stabilizer, and then you just cut your block to size. And the same thing with this. Now this one is only 9.5 inches, when our fabric again is 9 inches at the largest, or 8.5 if you cut it to size. And so this seems a little kind of chaotic, like nothing matches exactly the size of the stripes, but that's okay because you just quilt your entire piece of fabric and then you cut it to the size. Now, with that being said, I am not going to quilt these two with the words. I'm going to do all florals for mine. We already have our block that says Land That I Love, and it's very big. I think it was the first one that we did. However, you could, do all words. It doesn't matter, but I am going to choose to do all florals. So I am going to take this and delete. Again, if you're going to be doing these two, you'll do the same thing as me. Your quilting will just be a different design. So I'm going to take this one that I'm not going to use, and I'm going to delete it, and the same with the America. And so I am just going to copy, and I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to Command C and Command V to paste. And then the same thing with this one. I will select and copy and paste. Now, I think because these are all the same, I don't really want all these big flowers in a row. And And honestly, I'm not sure that that will even make a difference because of the red fabric. This one and the first and the third will be the red fabric. And I believe that they have red thread. And on another quilting that I did, one of our filler blocks had red thread on the red fabric, and you honestly couldn't even tell it was quilted. And so I am going to use the pearl color, which I used on that filler block, so at least I can see the quilting. And I want to see it because I love it. I love these florals. And so I think I am going to take one of these and flip it the other way just so that they're not exactly the same. Now remember, this is also 7 inches wide, and our finished size for the smaller, which these two are the smaller stripes, are going to be cut to 5.5. So we're going to lose some of this, and I could either cut it off one end, I could cut, equal amounts off both ends. So I don't necessarily even have to change this. I can change the look by how I cut that block. So I hope that makes sense, but I'm going to go ahead and just do that. And this one, I don't know if it's really going to matter. That one is still in the center. I'll just do it. But again, this is 9.5 inches. We're going to be cutting this down to 8.5 as the finished size. And so again, I could take the whole amount off one side so that then this, flower would look more like it's to the left. Anyways, I hope that makes sense. So you have some room to play with the design. You don't necessarily have to change them. In fact, you know what? I think I'm just going to leave them so I can show you that you don't have to do anything. You can do them all the same, and we can have them look different when we're done cutting. So these are the 4 that I'm going to do. And so I want to do, again, 2 with the larger fabric. And then I'm going to do 2 where I cut the fabric down to the correct size prior to quilting. So let's work on each of those. The first thing I'm going to do is select this corner part of the flag, and I'm going to delete it. I am going to just bring those files straight in from my machine and not do anything in software, so that I can concentrate on showing the 2 different ways to do these border stripes. So the first thing I'm going to do is select the smaller stripes, and I am going to Command X to cut those. And I've opened another page, and I am going to Command V to paste, so I have both of the smaller stripes on a different hoop. I will stitch those out in the 5x7. Now I want to make a few changes before I stitch these out, and so just to make it faster and easier, because I'm going to be doing the same design, I am going to select one of these and delete so I can make the changes on one and then just copy and paste it instead of having to make the changes on 2. But it doesn't really matter what you do. So the steps of the quilting are the same that we've had. We have the placement of the batting, the tack down of the batting, the placement of the fabric, the tack down of the fabric, and then the quilting. The only real difference for this border quilting is that the tack down only goes along the edge and not the ends, because you could use this as, let's say, a whole inner border for a big long quilt, and you wouldn't want there to be any stitching separating those blocks. So that is the only difference between a quilting background file and just a regular quilting file, is that there's no tack down or anything on the edges or on the ends. They are along the long edges. So now let's see what steps we're going to need for this border. So I definitely need the placement for the batting, so I know where to place the batting. I don't need a tack down because, again, I will cut my batting to this exact size, and that just wouldn't do anything. So I will select that and hit delete. The next step is going to be the placement for the fabric. And for the borders, I am going to leave the placement of the fabric. Now, normally I don't because our fabric is much larger. However, in the case of border fabrics, they are only cut about a 1/2 inch total larger than what we need. And so I need a little bit more precise placement than I do with the larger blocks. And so I am going to keep that placement. The next would be the tack down. Again, the tack down just goes along the edges. And of course, I need that to hold my fabric down, and then the quilting. So the only step that I will take out for these borders are the tack down of the batting. So now that I have that, I can go ahead and just select this and Command C to copy and Command V to paste, and I'll get my second copy that already has that change. It really would have just been as easy to select that second one and just delete that second step. But there's, you know, always lots of ways to do things. So I have these two designs, and I am going to select them and rotate. Doesn't matter which way because these, you know, can be flipped upside down, or it doesn't really matter. And then I am going to bump this down to make sure that it fits within my hoop, because I'm using the smallest hoop that I can stitch these out in, of course, to save stabilizer. So now these will be the large pieces of fabric that I have cut larger, that they were those sizes in the highlighted blue. So the small stripes again are cut to 2.5 by 6 inches. And I am going to separate these so that there's some room, because there will be a little bit of overlap because these have been cut a little larger. So now I want to run these at the same time. If I come to the stitch simulator, you can see there's two groups of colors, and that just shows that it will run one completely and then start on the second. And of course, because I'm in software, that's the great thing, is that I can color sort these and make each of those steps run together. Now I want to point something out. When we've done color sorting before, we did not want the placement, or we did not want some of the colors to have the same color thread over here on the right, because we didn't want those steps to merge because they needed to be run at different times. In this case, I can run the placement of the batting and the placement of the fabric at the same time. And so I can leave these two colors the same, and they are the same, of course, in both designs. And then I have the other colors are all the same, and so that's fine. So when I color sort, those first two steps will merge together. And that's okay for the borders. It works great for the borders. So let me come up to Utility and Color Sort. It's been changed by 3 color changes or 3 stops, and always select a new view. Now you can see I have one design and I have only 3 steps. So I have the first step. It will put the placement, which is this inner rectangle for the batting, and it also will stitch out the placement for the fabric. And again, I want that in this instance because our fabric isn't super large, and so I want to make sure that I have it going over where I need it to go. So it does both at the same time. And then the second would be to tack down those sides of the fabric, and then finally the quilting. So this again is for the size that I've cut larger. It's the 2.5 by 6 inch. And you can see that this design is 7 inches. And so when I run these 2 steps, my fabric is not going to go all the way to the bottom. And that's fine because we're going to end up cutting some off anyway. But it's going to be bigger than your fabric. And so some of this will run off onto the stabilizer, and that's fine. So this is for the small stripes with the larger fabric. So I'm going to come to File and Save Stitch File As, and I will just name Small Stripes. I will put it into my combined files folder and save it and then put it onto my USB. So now let's go back to the original that has the 2 large stripes. So I'm just going to leave it in this, and I have my 9 by 14, and that's just because these fit great sideways. And again, I can save on stabilizer because I will just load this and then bump these all the way down to the bottom and then save all the rest. However, you could, put it into a smaller hoop. It's 9.5, so you could, put it probably in your 6 by 10 or something like that. Now with these, we are going to do the exact same step as far as deleting that tack down of the batting. I will do it exactly the same. So the files will look the same, but placing our fabric will be a little bit different, and I'll show you. So these 2 versions really are not all that different, just a very slight exception. So the first thing, I'm going to leave both of these, and I will come up to the side and I will select that step 2, which is the tack down of the batting, and hit delete, and then come down to the second file, step 2, and hit delete. That's how easy, instead of copying and pasting. I'm going to leave these because I want the 2 first steps to run together. It just will save time and it will be done. So I'm going to come to Utility and Color Sort. It's been changed by 3 colors, and I always select a new view. So now I have one design with the 3 steps. Now you'll notice that the new view put it into a 5 by 7 hoop because that's the hoop that I was just working on, and so I will need to come up to the Preferences folder and change it back to my 9.5 by 14 and select OK. Then come to the compass and H, and that will put that whole hoop onto the screen. So now I can leave these. Now I didn't mention, but I'll mention it right now, these don't need to be that far apart. I made the other ones a little bit farther because the fabric will overlap this blue placement line. These will be cut to exactly the correct size, and so they will not extend beyond the placement line, and so these actually could have even been closer. And I'll show you again how these are the exact same steps that we're running and how they're slightly different as far as placing your fabric and going from there. Now these are ready to be saved, so I will come to File, Save Stitch File As, and I will name these large, what did I put the other ones? Stripes. So I'll do large stripes, save it into my combined folder, and save that and take it to my USB. So let's stitch out these flag pieces, and then once we have the quilting done on all of the individual pieces, we will use our sewing machine and stitch this block together. I wanted to jump back on because I just was getting ready to stitch these stripes out, and I noticed that I should have done one more thing when I was in software. So let me show you what I could have done to make this a little bit easier. I'm going to open my combined files folder where I just saved those 2 files, and I'm just going to bring in the large stripes just to show you what I should have done. So here's our one file. It has the 3 steps that are all combined for both sets. Now when I was making this, I wasn't really thinking about how these were going to stitch out with the thread colors. I was thinking more about the size because, for example, these large stripes I wanted to fit together, again, to use the least amount of stabilizer and put them into my 9 by 14 hoop. But when I was getting ready to load this onto my machine, I thought, oh, that's right. One is a red stripe that will have that pearl color thread, and one is an off-white that will have a blue thread. So right now, when it gets ready to do the quilting, it will not stop between these 2 because that's not what I did in software. So in order for me to change threads, when one completely stitches out and it cuts the thread, I'm going to manually stop my machine. I'll change the thread, and then I'll just continue for the second one. So it's really not a big deal. It just means that I have to babysit my machine a little bit more instead of maybe, you know, picking up my sewing room while it's stitching out. So if I were to do this again, I would have changed the color of one of the quilting designs. And we've done that before. So they were both default turquoise. And so before color sorting, I would have come to change the color. Could be any color, but then they would not have color sorted together and they would have been two separate steps. So that's one thing that I could have done. Again, I'm just going to manually stop it at my machine. The other thing I could have done was do one large stripe and one of the small stripes. Let's bring in the small stripes, because one of the large stripes and one of the small stripes are red fabric, and they will both have the pearl color thread. The other large and another small will be the off-white, and they will have blue thread. So I could have put, instead of two large together and two small together, again, I did that to save on stabilizer. I could have put one large and one small, and then just run that twice, and I wouldn't have had to change the background quilting because they would have been the same color thread. The large red would have had the pearl thread, and the small red would have had the pearl thread. So I hope that makes sense. So I could have made changes two different ways. It's, again, something I can just use as I have now and stop it at my machine. So let's go stitch these out. I am going to start with the corner of the flag. So I'm going to go to Embroidery and my USB. And this is the one that we did not do anything in the software. So I will just open my quilting bundle folder and pick that Stars Quilting and choose that star for the corner and hit set and Embroidery. Now I'm going to go to Layout and Move, and I'm just going to bump this all the way down since I have my stabilizer attached to the top of my hoop. And then I will come to this minus plus needle, and we're ready to start stitching. This is the same as all the blocks we have done. It will do the placement for the batting. I will place my batting that has been cut to size, and then I'm going to skip the next two steps, which is the tack down of the batting and the placement for the fabric, because our fabric is so much larger. And then I will tack the fabric down and run the quilting. Now I do want to note that if you are using the embellishment kit and are going to sew the buttons, the star buttons on, then this block is done. However, if you did not purchase the embellishment kit or wanted to go ahead and do the stitched stars on this, which looks like this, then when you brought the quilting in before starting, you would also bring the file in that has the stitch stars. I am using the buttons, and so this block is done for me. So now I'm going to hoop up and get ready for the small stripes. So I'm ready to add the small stripes. So I will go to Embroidery in my USB, and this time I'll go to my combined files folder, and I will bring in the small stripes and hit set. These fit right in the hoop, so I don't need to bump them down because they're exactly the right size. So I will select Embroidery, and I always like to go the minus plus, even if I don't think I'll use it. I just like to be on that screen. And I have my muslin hooped. Here is the corner of the flag that I have still attached. Again, that's totally optional. And I'm ready to stitch out the placement for the batting and the fabric, and I have just left the dark blue so that we could see it. So here are the batting and the fabric placement lines. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the batting, I'm just going to line it up to the left side, and you'll notice it doesn't go all the way down because remember this border design was longer than our piece of fabric. So I will line both of those up. And then I'm going to put the fabric down. Now, again, I did the fabric placement, which I normally don't do, and I'll show you why. On this one, you can see that this is the fabric placement and tack down, and how big our fabric is all the way around. And so you just don't need this little 1/4 of an inch on a regular block. Border blocks, it's different because our fabric, you'll notice, is pretty close. It's not much larger than the fabric placement. So I need that to make sure that I'm on track getting this placed correctly. Now, when this stitched out, it started, here's the top of my hoop. It started with this over here and then went to this one. And so I am going to leave my blue thread in so that I can see when I trim, it'll make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to put the white fabric because it will have blue stitching. I am going to put that at the top, and I will just line it up and make sure that the edges of the fabric, you know, overlap those outside lines. Now it looks like my batting's a little bit long, but that's okay. So again, I'm putting the white fabric here just because it started with this one, and then I already have my blue thread, which is what I'm going to use for this. And then I'll place my red fabric, make sure it extends past that. Again, I will stop my machine to put in the purl thread for the red piece. But I am going to tape the bottom because when this starts down here, it's going to travel up, and I don't want the foot to get caught. It will go up and then it'll come down this way. So I need to tape both. And when this is stitching out, it's going to stitch part of the design in here, which is fine. That'll just be cut off. I just don't want it to catch when it's doing the tack down or when it's doing the quilting. I don't know, you know, sometimes quilting will go over and come back and go over and come back. So I want to make sure that these edges are secure so that that foot does not catch them. So the next is the tack down, which will just run along the edges and not the ends. So after this finished stitching and cut, I went ahead and just stopped my machine so I can change my thread. Now I do want to mention that if I were to do this again, or if I would have thought about it, you know, you always learn something new when you're working on a project for the first time. I probably would have cut my batting to the finished size, which is 5.5 inches, and then had a little bit of fabric hanging over that batting line. Let's say the batting, because my batting is cut to 6 inches, same size as the length of these. So my batting is going to go to the very edge when I cut this. If I would have thought a little bit more about it, I would have cut my size batting to the finished size of my block, which would be 5.5, and then I would have had no batting in the seams. I'm going to have a little bit on these, but you know, like I said, you learn something new. So let's change the color and finish stitching this out. So I've taken this out of the hoop and I will cut these apart, and we can look at what's going on and how I would have done things different, and that I will change for the larger stripes. So if we look at this, which I love, I love the floor, and I'm glad I chose to do that for the stripes. Can't see it as, you know, well on this one, but at least you can tell there's quilting on it. So now these need to measure the 2 inch by 5.5 inches, Right now they're 2.5 by 6, and that's because they were cut a little bit bigger so we could do the tack down and trim them down after. Now, because my batting was also cut to 6-inch, wherever I cut there's going to be batting in a seam. And it's, you know, a small piece and it's not the end of the world, but I will change that with the larger. So what I need to do is first, I'm going to go give this a press, but let's just check. And we can see that if I just go between these stitching lines, you can tell the 2 is way over here. So that is not going to be the trimming. And that's, again, very important that you don't just automatically assume that that is the trimming guide, because it's not always. We need to be about 1/8 of an inch outside of that. So that's always important to check instead of just starting to trim, because it's 1/4 of an inch overall skinnier than it needs to be. So I hope that makes sense. So let me get these pressed and then we can cut these to size. So let's start with this square, and this needs to measure 3.5 by 3.5 trimmed. And so this is a quilting design that does not go into the seam allowance. So I will use the stitching as a guideline to measure before cutting, but then I will take this out and trim my muslin right next to the batting, especially since some of these are going to have batting in, so I don't want any muslin. So it's kind of hard to see because this is the same color, so I'm going to flip it to the back and we can see a little bit better. Maybe I can see it really good in person. Those outside lines I need to measure to see, again, if the quilting has pulled it in or if I can use those as my trimming. So if I line up with this outside line to this right, I am right on at 3.5, which is what I need to be. And same on this one, line it up with the left side. And I'm just a hair short. So if I cut, you know, just to the outside, so this is pretty close. So again, it might be a little bit hard to see, but I am going to just take my ruler and line it up just to the outside. And I'm going to put the block to my right instead of, you know, normally I would cut like this, but it's hard to see that stitching because it's the same color. So I am going to put the block to my right and put this right next to the line, and I'm going to trim that one side, and then I will do the same thing with the other side. And now to make sure you know, I'm exactly where I need to be, I'm going to use this cut side, line it up with my 3.5, make sure that it runs down straight and that this is across the top. And so now I can cut this side. And then the same thing, I will line up this cut side, make sure it's straight and straight on the top, and then I can cut. So that is my 3.5 by 3.5. I will go ahead and cut the muslin out of the seam allowance with that. So I'm going to cut these apart, and when I pressed them, I just pressed them from the back because I have all this tape and there's really no point in trying to get all that tape out that when we're going to cut this shorter anyways. So I just pressed from the back and, you know, didn't worry about the tape on the front. So now what I'm going to do is measure the width first. And again, if I hold this up on this tack down line, and I am needing this to be 2 inches. Well, if I cut this on the tack down line, you can see this goes way over here and then our quilting wouldn't be even. So I need to cut equal amounts on each side of the line. So if I move this over, it lines up just perfectly with the 1/8 inch mark. So as long as I line up an 1/8 inch over and an 1/8 inch over, then that will be how I cut. So I'm going to cut the right side first. So again, I want to make sure that my 1/8 inch mark is on this tack down line. Which, let me flip it so it's easier to see the top and not see the bottom where the 3 lines you can see. So again, for cutting the width of these blocks, they need to be 2 inches. And so I need to line up a little bit different because these stitching lines are not 2 inches apart. So I've lined up my 1/8 of an inch. It extends 1/8 of an inch beyond that stitching line. And then we'll flip it and do the same thing. So right now I have an 1/8 of an inch beyond the stitching line on this side, and I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to flip, and now I can line my 2 and make sure that it's straight all the way down. And if you notice now, the 1/8 of an inch is along this stitching line, which means that I will cut the edge of my ruler is an 1/8 inch past that. So that here is the 2 inch wide strip, and I of course still need to cut the width. I will go ahead and take out this basting and take out the muslin to get that out of the seam. So now I need to cut this 5.5 inches wide. And so let's just look. This one, you know, it's not as easy to see, obviously, as the white. And so it doesn't really matter, you know, how these line up. So I am just going to take, and you know, you don't have a lot of room to work with. So I'm just going to cut right next to this piece over here where the tape is, because I don't want to cut beyond the tape, so I have to pull that out. So the first that I'm going to do is line up, of course, the top of this so I know that it's straight. And I'm going to come right next to that tape. Make sure it's even. So now I have the end cut. So now I can flip it, and now I can measure the 5.5. So I will put my 5.5 to that I just cut, line it up along the top. And of course, my 2 will also line up because I cut it 2 inches wide. So now I have just a little bit, and I don't have the tape in that. So now this measures 2 by 5.5, which is what this needs to measure. So let's do the same thing with this one. I'm ready to stitch out the large stripes, and I have cut them down to the 2 inch finished size that they need to be. I did leave them the 9 inches long. I will cut the width when we're done quilting, but these are the finished height because they will be, you know, put in the block like this. So these are finished 2 inches. I also cut the batting to 8 inches. Because this block will be 8.5 inches wide, I want this a 1/2 inch smaller so that I have 1/4 of an inch on each end so that the batting won't be in the seam allowance. And that's what I learned from doing the first 2 small blocks. So I have the design loaded with the large stripes, and I have them all the way bumped down to the bottom of the hoop so I can save all of the stabilizer. And I'm ready to stitch out the placement for the batting and the fabric. I have the placement line, so I'm going to place the batting. And remember, my batting is going to be shorter than the template that it just stitched out, and so will my fabric. So I am just going to roughly place this in the middle. It doesn't have to be perfect. And put that down. I will do both. So you can see I have space at the top and space at the bottom. Now I'm going to put my white fabric on top. This is the top, towards the top of my hoop, because I have the blue thread in, and then that's just one less thread that I have to change. And you'll notice that my fabric, of course, is a little bit larger. So I'm just going to do, doesn't have to be perfect because I have a 1/2 inch to play with this fabric. So if I have a little bit fabric over each end of the batting, I'm good. But the difference in this method versus the one we did before is now I place this fabric exactly with this placement line. The other short stripes went over these placement lines. This is cut exactly to size, and so these are placed right within that line. And I'm going to move this up just a little bit. Again, trying to get it as centered as I can so that I have a little bit of room to play with on each end. Doesn't have to be perfect. So now you can see that my fabric is lined up within those placement lines where last time they went over. And I will do the same. Now I am going to tape these because it will do that same stitch, and I don't want that placement line to come up and then move and mess up our fabric. So I'll just put tape towards the ends, just on the very end. After the blue thread got finished, I went ahead and just manually stopped my machine again, and I'm changing to the pearl so that I can finish out the red. So you can see that the quilting was, of course, a little bit longer than our fabric, and I think they look great. I love this floral. And seeing the centers of the flowers and it's exactly the same doesn't bother me, because this you don't notice as much. And even, I guess, even if it was two light colors, it's not that big of a deal. But I love that I can see this has a little bit of quilting on it. So now you can see that our strips are cut to exactly the same size width-wise that we need. So we don't have to do any trimming on the sides. The only thing I will do is take out this tack down and then cut, my muslin back to the batting line. And so the only thing I need to do is cut the width of this. So let me get that removed and we'll cut these to size. So I have the basting out, and again, I'm going to trim right next to the batting line, but I want to show you that how the stitching stitched off of the fabric to finish off, of course, the background quilting, because that was a little bit larger than our fabric. And so I can't just remove the back to the batting because it's stitched on. So I hope that you can see right, and I think you can, right here is where the fabric ends. You can see it on this side. So here's where the fabric ends, and then you can see, I hope, 1/4 of an inch over right here is the where the batting ends. And if you need to look, you can, pull this back and see that that's batting ends right here. and in person I can see it. So I can see right here is where the batting ends and then the fabric ends over. The same thing here. Here's where the batting ends and then the fabric. And I've marked this. This might be easier to see because it has light stitching. So here is where my batting, and then you can see the fabric ends. So again, I cut my batting to 8 inches because these blocks will be 8.5. So when I cut these to 8.5, you can see that the batting will not be in the seam allowance. So I'm going to leave these turned over because I need that guideline of where the batting is. And so let's measure that again on this one. From those lines that I marked for the batting, that's 8 inches. So I need to cut 1/4 of an inch past each of those lines. To cut this, I'm going to line up the 1/4 inch because I need to cut 1/4 of an inch past that batting. And I've got that mark lined up with 1/4 of an inch. And I'm just going to draw it so that we can see what we're doing. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I will line up the 1/4 inch, which is right here. Make sure that it's straight and mark that. And that's just if you want to make sure you're cutting the right size. So now if I go from the outside lines, I'm just a hair over 8, and that might be because my, pencil is kind of wide. So I will just come in and cut, but that's almost perfect. So what I'm going to do is cut this one side, and I'll just line this up. And now to be extra precise, I won't necessarily go by that line, but I can come to the 8.5 and mark and line that up with the cut line that I just made. And I can line up one of the other stitching lines to make sure I'm even. And then I have the 1/4 inch on each side. There is muslin, but now you can see it better. But the batting will not be into the seam. So I will go ahead and take out the rest of the muslin on the length of it. So let me cut this one. So here are all the pieces done. And I do have to say that when I do borders, whether they're small 1 inch up to the 4, 5, or 6 inch borders, I prefer to do it like I did the larger stripes. And that is where I cut the fabric exactly to size and line it up right with that placement line instead of having the fabric cut bigger. But that's how I like to do borders. So now, what a cute flag this is. I really love the flowers, and I'm glad I chose that. So now I just need to stitch these together. And the first two will be these small stripes stitched. And then, of course, the large stripes will be stitched together. And then the blue with the top stripes. And then finally this, and our patchwork flag will be finished. I do want to mention one thing. Now, if you can see that here's all the large flowers, I'm not too concerned about these because, honestly, you barely can tell. You can tell there's quilting, but it's not as pronounced as these two. So what I think I might do, because no matter what way I turn that, it's going to be in the center. I think I'm going to flip this around and sew it like that so that this bigger flower that's more pronounced in the blue doesn't look so lined up. Anyway, so that's how I'm going to stitch mine out. So I pressed the seams open for the stripes, and then I sewed the blue square to the small stripes. And when I press it, I'm just pressing it to one side because remember, these have batting in the seam allowance, and so I am pressing them so that the small stripe is just flat and not folded back on itself because of all that batting.